never thought my life would take such a turn. It wasn't long ago that I believed in love, in trust, and in the future I had with Kyle. But now, as I look back, I realize how wrong I was. The story of how my marriage unraveled is one of deceit, betrayal, and heartbreak. And it all started with a single decision: to let Kyle into my life. When I first met Kyle, he seemed perfect. He was 4 years younger than me, running a small cafe in Los Angeles, full of dreams and ambition. His eyes would light up whenever he talked about his plans for the future, how he wanted to expand the cafe, make it a hotspot in the city, and achieve financial success. I worked at a credit union, and Kyle had come in as a client. At the time, I was handling his finances, helping him secure loans for his business. We became close during that period, and it wasn't long before our professional relationship turned personal. We started dating after a few meetings outside of work. He seemed so caring, so full of life. I had almost given up on marriage in my mid-30s, but Kyle reignited a spark in me. He wasn't just a man with a vision for his business. He had a vision for us. Or so I thought. Within 6 months, we were married, and I thought I had found the happiness I had been waiting for. But the first cracks in our relationship began to appear shortly after we moved in together. We found a modest apartment, nothing too extravagant, but it was enough for the two of us. I had no complaints about our living situation, but I could tell Kyle wasn't entirely happy. He had always talked about wanting to live a luxurious life in LA, surrounded by wealth and success. It was subtle at first, but over time, his dissatisfaction with our lifestyle became more apparent. Still, I pushed those thoughts to the back of my mind. I convinced myself that once his cafe took off, things would get better. We would have more money, more freedom, and Kyle would be happy again. But deep down, I knew something was off. There were moments when his eyes would linger too long on flashy cars, expensive homes, and the lives of people who had far more than we did. I tried to dismiss it as simple envy, but there was something darker lurking beneath. Then came the day that changed everything. My father, who had been living alone since my mother passed away, had taken a fall on the stairs. He was in his late 60s and still living in the high-rise condo my parents had bought many years ago. I had been visiting him less frequently since I married Kyle, but after his fall, I knew I had to step in. My father was fiercely independent, but I could tell he was struggling, even though he tried to hide it. When I told Kyle about my father's condition, I suggested that we move in with him to help out. It seemed like the right thing to do. After all, my father was getting older, and his health was deteriorating. I expected Kyle to resist the idea. After all, who wants to live with their in-laws? But to my surprise, he agreed almost immediately. "Let's do it," Kyle said, his face lighting up in a way that made me uneasy. "It'll be good for us, and it's close to my cafe too." I didn't think too much of it at the time. I was just relieved that Kyle was on board. We moved into my father's high-rise condo, and for a while, everything seemed fine. My father was grateful for the help, and Kyle appeared to be getting along with him. On weekends, I would drive my father around to the places he wanted to visit, and Kyle would take care of the house while we were gone. It felt like a good arrangement, one that benefited everyone. But then, slowly, things began to shift. Kyle's cafe wasn't doing as well as he had hoped. The income wasn't steady, and he became more reliant on my father's financial support. My father, who had rental income from other properties, was generous, offering to help Kyle with his business. But Kyle started to change. He began to distance himself from the responsibilities of the household. When my father became bedridden after another fall, Kyle's reluctance to help became more noticeable. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I thought maybe Kyle was just stressed about the cafe, that he was tired from trying to make ends meet. But it wasn't just stress. It was something else. Kyle started to avoid caring for my father altogether. Even though he had agreed to live with us, to help out when I wasn't home, he started making excuses. "I have too much work at the cafe," he would say, or "I'm just not cut out for caregiving." I could feel the tension growing, but I didn't know what to do. My father had always been kind to Kyle, and it hurt to see him neglected in his time of need. I had taken on all the household responsibilities, cleaning, cooking, and caring for my father after long days at work. Kyle barely lifted a finger, and it made me angry, but I was too afraid to confront him. I didn't want to risk our marriage. Then, one day, I came home to find that my father's lunch, component placement which I had prepared in the morning, was still untouched in the kitchen. My heart sank. I rushed to his room, fearing the worst. "Dad, are you okay?" I asked, kneeling beside him. He smiled weakly and nodded. "I'm fine, Sophia. Don't worry, I didn't feel hungry today." I knew he was lying. He was trying to cover for Kyle, who had clearly neglected to take care of him. I wanted to confront Kyle, but I bit my tongue. Maybe this was just a one-time thing, I told myself. Maybe Kyle had genuinely forgotten, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. As the weeks passed, Kyle's neglect became more frequent. He stopped helping with my father altogether, and whenever I asked him to do something, he would snap at me. "Why do I have to take care of your dad? I never agreed to this," he yelled one night when I asked him to serve my father's dinner. "But you did agree," I reminded him, my voice trembling. "You said we would do this together." Kyle scoffed, rolling his eyes. "That was before I realized how much work it would be. This isn't my responsibility, Sophia. I didn't sign up to be a caregiver." His words cut deep, but I didn't argue. I was exhausted from working all day and then coming home to take care of my father. I didn't have the energy to fight with Kyle, but I couldn't ignore the growing resentment that was building inside me. Then, everything changed when my father passed away. It was sudden and unexpected, and I was devastated. My father had been my rock, the one constant in my life, and now he was gone. In the days following his death, I was overwhelmed with grief. But Kyle didn't seem to care. The night after the funeral, Kyle came to me with a smug look on his face. "So, now that your dad's gone, what happens to the high-rise condo?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes gleaming with greed. I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "What do you mean?" Kyle shrugged. "Well, it's yours now, right? I think it's only fair that I get it." My heart raced as I realized what he was saying. "You want my father's condo?" Kyle nodded, a cold smile spreading across his face. "I've been patient, Sophia. I've put up with a lot, and I think I deserve something in return." I felt sick to my stomach. "Kyle, this isn't about you. My father just died." But he wasn't listening. "Look, my parents are selling their house to move here, and they'll need a place to stay. The condo is perfect for them. Just hand it over, and we'll be done with all this." I couldn't believe his audacity. "You want me to give my father's condo to your parents?" Kyle's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard stare. "Yes. And if you don't, we're getting a divorce." The words hung in the air like a threat. I felt a wave of disbelief and anger wash over me. This was the man I had married, the man I thought loved me. And now, he was revealing that all he cared about was the inheritance. Something inside me snapped. "Fine," I said, my voice calm but full of resolve. "Let's get a divorce." Kyle blinked, caught off guard. "Wait, what?" "You heard me?" I said, standing up. "I won't stay married to someone who only cared about my father's money. You can have your divorce, but you're not getting the condo." Kyle tried to argue, but I wasn't listening. I had already made up my mind. Over the next few days, I took legal action. I had sold the condo to my father's friend, Mr. Simpson, before Kyle could get his hands on it. When Kyle found out, he was furious. "You can't do this," he screamed. But it was too late. Mr. Simpson, who also happened to be a lawyer, made sure that Kyle had no legal claim to the property. Kyle tried to fight it, but in the end he lost. Not just the condo, but everything. In the months that followed, Kyle's life spiraled out of control. His cafe went under, and he was left with nothing. Meanwhile, I moved on. I sold the family home and bought a small apartment, starting fresh. It took time to heal from the betrayal, but I eventually found peace. My father had always taught me to stand up for myself, and in the end, that's what I did. I may have lost Kyle, but I gained something far more important: my freedom. And as for Kyle? Well, the last I heard, he was struggling to find work, bouncing from one job to the next. His parents, who had been so eager to move into the condo, were now renting a small apartment, scraping by on part-time jobs. Looking back, I realized that everything happens for a reason. Kyle came into my life, and for a while, I believed in him. But the truth always comes out in the end, and when it did, I was ready to face it head-on. Now, I'm free to live my life on my own terms, just as my father would have wanted. And that's all that matters.
I took back my daughter's college fund after she said she's going no contact. Okay, so here's the deal. I'm a single mom, 45F, with 2 kids, Ella, 18F, and Jake, 16M. Life hasn't exactly been a walk in the park for us, especially after my husband passed away when the kids were really young. I mean, I'm talking about when they were barely old enough to understand what was going on. So, yeah, it's just been me for the last 12 years holding everything together. I think it's important to mention up front that when my husband passed, he left behind a life insurance policy. I guess that was his way of making sure we were going to be okay, you know? And I don't want to sound ungrateful or anything. It definitely helped. But the truth is, money doesn't last forever, and life doesn't get cheaper just because you have a little cushion in the bank. I had to be smart about it. The first thing I did was make sure the basic stuff was covered. House payments, groceries, bills, just the usual stuff that you've got to deal with. But what really kept me awake at night was making sure that my kids wouldn't be stuck in a financial hole when they grew up, especially with how expensive college is nowadays. And since Ella had always been super into school, I knew college was definitely going to be in her future. So I made a decision early on to set aside part of that life insurance money into a college fund for both Ella and Jake. The goal was simple. I didn't want them drowning in debt after school. That college fund became the center of everything I did. It's not like we lived a glamorous life, but I made sure the bills were paid, food was on the table, and the rest of the money went into that fund. There were no extravagant vacations, no big purchases, and honestly, I barely bought anything for myself. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't like I was miserable or anything. I just had my priorities straight. It was all about making sure my kids were going to have a solid future. Ella, from a young age, was always talking about getting into one of those prestigious colleges. You know, the kind you see in movies, where everyone's got perfect dorm rooms, and they walk around campus with books under their arms, looking all smart. She was obsessed with the idea, and I honestly couldn't have been prouder of her for dreaming big. I mean, I wanted that for her. I wanted her to go somewhere that would open doors and give her the kind of opportunities I never had growing up. And we talked about it a lot. Over the years, we had countless conversations about college and the importance of education. She knew the sacrifices I was making, and I always made sure she understood that the money I was saving was specifically for her and Jake's future. I didn't want there to be any misunderstandings. The college fund was off limits for anything else. Now, I'll be the first to admit, things weren't always perfect between me and Ella. I mean, what mother-daughter relationship is, right? She's a teenager, and with that comes the usual drama. But for the most part, we got along fine. And I always thought we had a pretty close bond. We'd have our arguments here and there, like any family does, but nothing ever felt like it was tearing us apart. But I guess looking back now, I should have paid more attention to the little changes. It's easy to ignore things when you're just trying to keep the day-to-day going. You get caught up in work, making sure the house isn't falling apart, and just managing life in general. But when I think about it now, I can see there were some red flags I probably should have noticed earlier. Ella started hanging out with a different crowd during her last year of high school. Nothing too wild, but just different from the friends she used to have. I didn't think much of it at first. Kids grow up and their interests change, right? But I could see that she was starting to pull away from me a little. She wasn't as open with me as she used to be. We weren't having those long talks like we used to, where we'd sit in the kitchen and she'd tell me about her day or her plans or whatever was on her mind. Those moments just kind of stopped. And then there was her attitude. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm complaining about normal teenage stuff because I get it. Teenagers are moody. But Ella started saying things that really hurt. She'd snap at me over small things like asking her to clean her room or help with dinner, saying that I was smothering her or treating her like a baby. It stung, but I figured it was just a phase and that she'd come around eventually. I mean, we all go through that, don't we? Still, it was hard not to notice that she was pulling further and further away, and I couldn't help but feel like there was something else going on. It wasn't just normal teenage rebellion. It felt bigger, like there was something she wasn't telling me, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Then she started dating Matt. That's when things really started to shift. I had met him a couple of times, and he seemed okay on the surface, polite enough, didn't seem like trouble or anything. But after they started spending more time together, Ella changed. She wasn't just moody or distant anymore. She was flat out cold. She'd go from ignoring me to snapping at me for the smallest things. It felt like I couldn't do anything right, no matter how hard I tried. Every time I brought up college or her future, she'd shut the conversation down and say I was stressing her out. It was so out of character for her. I started to feel like I didn't even know my own daughter anymore. I wanted to ask her if something was wrong, if there was something going on between her and Matt, but I was scared of pushing her further away. It's a fine line to walk when your kid's growing up. You want to be involved, but not overbearing. And to be honest, I didn't want to believe that things were getting that bad. I thought it was just a rough patch we'd get through eventually. But deep down, I was worried. The more distant she got, the more I started questioning myself. Had I done something wrong? Had I missed something important along the way? I've always tried my best as a mom, but seeing her slip away like that, it made me feel helpless. And all this time, that college fund was still sitting there, untouched, waiting for her. I never imagined that the very thing I worked so hard to build for her would end up being a point of tension between us. But it's funny how life works sometimes. Just when you think you've got everything figured out, things take a turn you never saw coming. So things really started shifting when Ella began dating Matt. I'll admit, at first, I didn't think too much of it. He seemed like a regular guy, a bit older than Ella, but nothing that raised any major red flags at the time. I met him a couple of times when he'd come over for dinner or just hang out at our place. He was polite, said all the right things, and I figured if Ella liked him, then he must be a decent guy. I mean, she's smart, right? She's always had good judgment, so I trusted her on that. But man, after a few weeks of them dating, everything just changed. I noticed it slowly at first. Like she'd start staying out later than usual and wouldn't tell me where she was going. If I asked, she'd either brush me off or give me this annoyed look, like I was being unreasonable for even asking. And I get it. She's 18, almost an adult. But I don't think it's crazy to want to know where your kid is, you know? It wasn't just her being out late, though. It was her whole attitude. She became distant, like she didn't want to talk to me anymore. Before Matt came into the picture, we used to have these talks in the kitchen about school, about her future, just regular stuff. But those moments got fewer and fewer, and when I tried to bring it up, she'd get defensive. She'd say things like, "Mom, you're suffocating me," or "You treat me like I'm still a little kid." That one hurt, honestly, because I thought I was giving her enough space. One night, we had a small argument over something trivial, like I think I asked her to help out with the dishes or something, and she just exploded. Out of nowhere, she started going off about how I'm always on her case, how I never let her do anything, how I treat her like a baby. She even accused me of trying to control her life, which is so far from the truth. All I've ever tried to do was make sure she had the best possible future. That's when I started getting worried about Matt. I didn't know if he was saying things to her or if she was just influenced by him in some way, but it felt like her entire personality was shifting the longer she spent with him. Like this wasn't the Ella I knew, the Ella I raised, and I had no idea how to get through to her because every time I tried, it turned into another fight. And the thing is, I wasn't just imagining this stuff. Even Jake noticed it. He's a pretty quiet kid, but one day he came to me and said, "Mom, what's going on with Ella? She's always so mad now." That broke my heart because if Jake, who barely says a word most of the time, could see it, then I knew I wasn't overreacting. Something was definitely up. The more time Ella spent with Matt, the worse things got at home. She'd disappear for entire weekends and barely text me back when I'd check in. I tried to talk to her about it, but it always ended the same way, with her telling me I was being too controlling or treating her like a kid. I didn't even know how to respond anymore. I didn't want to push her further away, but I couldn't just sit there and let her slip out of my life like that either. I started to wonder if Matt was really the problem, or if it was just part of her growing up and me having a hard time letting go. You know those late-night thoughts when you're lying in bed, trying to make sense of things? But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about her growing up. This wasn't the natural teenage rebellion everyone talks about. This felt different. There was this tension between us that hadn't been there before. I even tried to be nice to Matt, thinking maybe if I made an effort with him, things between me and Ella would get better. I invited him over for dinner a few more times, tried to engage him in conversation, but he was always kind of distant. He'd answer my questions, but he never really tried to get to know me. It was like he was just there to be with Ella and didn't care about building a relationship with me or Jake. And honestly, the more I saw them together, the more uneasy I felt about their relationship. There was something about the way he seemed to have this influence over her. It was subtle, but it was there. It wasn't just that Ella was being rude to me either. She stopped caring about her future, too. All those dreams she had of going to a good college, getting a degree. Suddenly, none of that seemed to matter to her anymore. Anytime I brought it up, she'd roll her eyes and say things like, "I'll figure it out, Mom," or "Stop stressing me out about it." I started feeling like I was the only one who still cared about her future, and that scared me. College was always the plan. It's what we talked about for years. How could she just suddenly not care? One night, I decided to sit her down for a serious talk. I didn't want to fight with her. I just wanted to understand what was going on in her head. I asked her about college, about Matt, about why she'd been acting so distant. And I swear, the look on her face, it was like I was a stranger to her. She didn't say much, just kept repeating that I was overreacting, that everything was fine, and that I needed to stop worrying so much. But I couldn't stop worrying. I mean, how could I? This was my daughter, the same kid who used to talk about her dream school and all the things she wanted to achieve. And now, it was like she didn't even care anymore. I couldn't just sit back and watch her throw all that away without trying to help. So I asked her, straight up, if Matt had something to do with this change. If he was saying things that made her pull away from me. If he was influencing her decisions. And that's when she completely blew up. I'd never seen her so angry before. She accused me of not trusting her, of trying to control her relationship, and said that Matt had nothing to do with it, that it was all me, that I was the problem. I didn't know what to say. It's one thing to have your kid be mad at you, but it's another thing to hear them say that you are the reason everything's falling apart. I felt like I was losing her, and no matter what I said or did, it just pushed her further away. At that point, I knew something had to give. I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine when clearly it wasn't. But I didn't know how to fix it, and I didn't know how to get Ella back. It felt like the more I tried, the worse things got. And Matt? He was always there in the background, watching it all happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had more to do with this than Ella was willing to admit. But how do you say that without pushing your kid away for good? It felt like I was walking on eggshells every time I tried to talk to her, and I was terrified that one wrong step would make everything fall apart even more. So the breaking point came during what I thought was going to be just another regular argument. We'd been having more and more of those lately, with Ella constantly pushing back against everything I said. And I get it. She's 18, she's almost an adult, and she wants her independence. But the way she'd been acting, it was like I didn't even recognize her anymore. I knew things were tense between us, but I never expected what came next. It started over something small, like most of our arguments had been lately. I think I asked her if she had thought about her college applications, and it just set her off. She snapped at me, telling me to stop stressing her out and that she had everything under control. I remember feeling this frustration bubbling up inside me because honestly, nothing seemed under control. She wasn't talking about college like she used to. She wasn't talking to me at all, really, so I pushed a little harder, probably more than I should have, and that's when it happened. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I'm done with you, Mom. When I leave for college, I'm going no contact. I don't need you anymore." I don't think I'll ever forget that moment. It felt like my heart just stopped, like someone had knocked the air out of me. I couldn't even respond right away because I was so shocked. I mean, after everything I had done for her, everything I had sacrificed, this was what she thought of me? That she could just cut me out of her life as soon as she was old enough to leave? I must have looked stunned because she kept going. "You've been controlling my whole life," she said. "Once I'm gone, I'm not coming back. I don't want anything to do with you." That's when I lost it. All the years of holding back, trying to be the best mom I could be, making sacrifices, working late nights, all of it came rushing to the surface. I started listing everything I had done for her, telling her how much I had given up just to make sure she and Jake had a good life. I reminded her about the college fund, how I had saved every extra penny from her dad's life insurance to make sure she could go to the best school without being buried in debt. But she just stood there, arms crossed, with this look on her face like she didn't care, like none of it mattered. And honestly, that hurt more than anything she'd said so far. It was like she had completely shut off her emotions, and I couldn't get through to her at all. "I didn't ask you to do that," she finally said. "You keep throwing it in my face like I owe you something. I don't. I never asked for any of it." Hearing her say that was like a slap in the face. It made me realize just how far we drifted apart. I thought she understood, that we were on the same page about her future and how much I was doing to make sure she could have it. But clearly, I had been wrong. She didn't see it that way at all. To her, I was just this overbearing, controlling parent who was suffocating her with expectations. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel myself getting more and more upset. Ella, I've done everything I could to give you the life you wanted, I said. And this is how you repay me? By saying you're cutting me out of your life as soon as you don't need me anymore? That's not fair. She didn't even flinch. I'm not a little girl anymore, Mom, she shot back. I don't need you. I'll be fine on my own. That's when I realized that no matter what I said, it wasn't going to make a difference. Ella had made up her mind, and nothing I could do or say was going to change that. I was angry, sure, but more than that, I was heartbroken. I had spent 18 years building a life for her and her brother, making sure they had everything they needed, and now she was telling me that none of it mattered. And it wasn't just about the money or the sacrifices I made. It was about the fact that she was ready to walk away from me entirely, like I was just some obstacle in her path. She wasn't even considering how much it would hurt me, how much it would hurt her brother to lose her. It was all about her, and that was the part I couldn't wrap my head around. After a few moments of silence, I asked her, "So what happens to Jake? Are you going no contact with him too? Or is it just me you're done with?" She rolled her eyes like the question was ridiculous. "Of course not," she said. "I'll still talk to Jake. But you? I need space from you, Mom. I need to live my own life." I couldn't believe it. She was ready to completely shut me out, but she'd still keep in touch with Jake? It didn't make any sense to me. I had been there for both of them since day one, and now she was acting like I was the enemy, like I was some roadblock she had to get past. I knew I had to leave the conversation before it got even worse. So I just said, "If that's really what you want, Ella, then I can't stop you. But I want you to really think about what you're saying before you make any decisions you can't take back." She just shrugged and walked away like it was no big deal. Like she hadn't just dropped a bomb on me. I remember standing there in the kitchen staring after her, feeling like my whole world had just been flipped upside down. How did we get here? How did my relationship with my own daughter get to the point where she wanted to cut me out of her life? I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. Was I really being too controlling? Had I smothered her without realizing it? Or was this just Matt's influence, making her see me as the bad guy? The next few days were awkward. Ella didn't say much, and I didn't know what to say to her either. There was this tension hanging over the house, and every time I saw her, I felt that pit in my stomach. I wanted to talk to her to try to fix things, but I didn't know how. It was like there was this wall between us now, and I had no idea how to break it down. Jake could tell something was off too. He asked me once, "Mom, is everything okay with Ella?" And I just told him it was fine because I didn't want to drag him into it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't fine. It wasn't fine at all. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was falling apart, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. So, after Ella dropped that whole no contact thing on me, I spent a few days just kind of lost, honestly. I didn't know what to do. I mean, how do you respond when your own kid tells you they don't want you in their life anymore? It's not like there's a manual for this kind of thing. I kept thinking back to our conversation, replaying it in my head over and over, trying to figure out if there was something I missed. Maybe I had been too controlling. Maybe I had pushed her too hard. But I just didn't see how wanting the best for her made me the bad guy. The silence in the house was unbearable. Ella and I were barely talking, and the few times we did talk, it was all short answers and eye rolls. The tension was so thick, you could practically cut it with a knife. Jake was starting to notice too, but he kept his head down like he didn't want to get caught in the middle of it. Smart kid. Then came the night when everything really blew up. I wasn't planning on confronting her again, not so soon after the last argument, but sometimes things just happen when you're not ready for them. Ella had come home late, again, and I asked her where she'd been. I didn't mean to start anything, I was just genuinely curious. But of course, it escalated. She gave me the same attitude she'd been giving me for weeks. "Why do you always need to know where I am? I'm not a kid anymore, Mom. Stop treating me like one." Now I know I should have probably just let it go, but it was late, and I was tired. And honestly, I was done tiptoeing around her like I had been these last few days. I snapped back, "Because I'm still your mom, Ella, and I care about you. Is that such a bad thing?" And that's when it all came pouring out. She turned to me, eyes filled with frustration, and said, "You're not caring. You're controlling. You've been controlling me my whole life. Everything's always been about what you want for me, never about what I want." That hit me hard. I'd always thought I was doing what was best for her, giving her a stable future, making sure she had everything she needed to succeed. But hearing her say that, it was like she saw all my efforts as some kind of leash, like I was holding her back instead of lifting her up. I didn't know what to say. I was caught between wanting to defend myself and not wanting to push her further away. You act like I haven't given up so much for you and Jake, I said, my voice shaking a little. Everything I've done has been for you. I've worked my whole life to make sure you didn't have to struggle. I saved that college fund so you could go to the school of your dreams, Ella, and now you're saying it doesn't matter? Exactly, she shot back. You did all of that, but not because I asked you to. You keep using the college fund as if it's some kind of bargaining chip to control what I do. I never wanted to be in debt to you like that. In debt? I could hardly believe what I was hearing. This isn't about debt. It's about giving you the chance to succeed without being buried in loans. How could you think that? Ella shook her head, her arms crossed tight over her chest like she was trying to keep herself from exploding. You don't get it, do you? You've made everything about you. The money, the plans, all of it. I never had a say in anything. And now you're surprised I don't want to be a part of it anymore? That was the moment I realized just how different we were seeing things. To me, everything I had done had been out of love, out of a desire to protect her and make sure she had the opportunities I didn't. But to her, it was control. Every sacrifice I made, every late night working extra hours, it wasn't seen as love. It was seen as a cage. And as much as it hurt to hear her say that, I had to face the reality that, somewhere along the way, we had stopped understanding each other. Ella, all I've ever wanted was for you to have the life you dreamed of, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. How did it get to this? Why do you feel like I'm the enemy here? She let out a frustrated sigh. Because you never listened to me. Every time I try to make my own decisions, you're right there, telling me what I should do, what's best for me. You never even asked what I wanted. I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was sinking in quicksand, and every word I said just pulled me deeper. Maybe she was right. Maybe I hadn't listened as much as I thought I had. I always assumed I knew what was best because I was her mom and I'd lived through it. I thought that was my job, to guide her, to keep her on track. But maybe I'd been holding on too tightly without even realizing it. So what do you want then, Ella? I asked, feeling a lump in my throat. If you could have it your way, what would that look like? Her answer came fast, almost like she'd been waiting for me to ask. I just want to live my own life without you hovering over me. I want to make my own choices, even if they're mistakes. And I don't want you holding the college fund over my head like it's some reward for being the daughter you want me to be. That's when it hit me that, in her eyes, the college fund wasn't a gift. It was a weight. Something she felt like she had to earn instead of something that was there because I loved her. And that realization crushed me. I never meant for it to feel that way, I said quietly. The college fund, everything I've done, it was never about control. It was because I love you and I wanted to give you a good life. I know you love me, Mom, she said, her voice softening just a little. But I need you to let go. I need to live my life for me, not for you. There was a long silence after that. I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads, and no matter which way I turned, I was going to lose something. If I let her go, if I stopped pushing her toward the future I'd envisioned for her, was I letting her down? But if I kept holding on, I'd push her even further away. It was a no-win situation. I don't want to lose you, I finally said, my voice breaking, but I don't know how to just let go. Ella sighed, her arms dropping to her sides. You won't lose me, Mom, but I need space, and I need you to trust me. I nodded, but deep down I wasn't sure if I could trust her judgment. How could I, when every instinct I had told me she was making the wrong decisions? But maybe that was the point. Maybe she needed to make her own mistakes. And maybe I needed to learn how to step back, even if it scared the hell out of me. That night, after Ella went to bed, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, thinking about everything. About how hard I had tried to give her the best life possible, and how it had somehow turned into something that pushed her away. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, loving someone meant letting them find their own way, even if you don't agree with the path they're taking. But one thing was clear. I wasn't ready to give up on her. Not yet. So after that conversation with Ella, I spent a lot of time thinking about everything she said, about how I'd been holding on too tight, about how she felt like I wasn't giving her any control over her own life. It wasn't easy to hear, but deep down, I knew there was some truth in what she said. I've always been the kind of mom who's involved in every little detail, making sure things are going smoothly, making sure the kids are on the right track. I never thought of it as being controlling. I just wanted to help her avoid the mistakes I made when I was younger. But after that night, I had to face reality. Ella didn't want my help anymore. She didn't want my guidance. She wanted space. She wanted freedom. And she wanted to do things her way. And honestly, that scared the hell out of me. I'd spent years saving up that college fund for her, putting away money from her dad's life insurance, and working extra hours so she could go to a good school without worrying about debt. But now she was telling me she didn't care about that. She didn't care about the fund. All she cared about was getting away from me and doing her own thing. So I had to ask myself, what was the point of holding on to the college fund if she didn't even want my help? If she didn't want to be a part of my life, why should I be the one to make sure she had everything she needed for her future? I tried to put off making any decisions, but the longer I sat with it, the more it ate away at me. I couldn't stop thinking about how she'd said she was going no contact, how she planned to leave and not look back. It felt like a punch to the gut every time I remembered those words, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I didn't want to be petty or spiteful, but I also didn't want to be a doormat. I mean, I had worked my ass off to give her everything, and now she was telling me I wasn't even going to be a part of her life anymore. It just didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that if she was serious about cutting me off, then I had no obligation to fund her future. Why should I? One evening, after another day of tense silence in the house, I decided it was time to talk to her again. I needed to lay it all out on the table, to be upfront with her about how I was feeling. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about respect. It was about her understanding that I wasn't just some ATM she could use and then discard when she didn't need me anymore. So I knocked on her door and asked if we could talk. She sighed, clearly not in the mood for another conversation, but she let me in. Look, I started, trying to keep my tone calm. I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other night, about wanting to live your own life, about not wanting me to be so involved. Ella didn't say anything, just stared at the floor, her arms crossed over her chest. I took that as my cue to keep going. I understand that you're ready to be independent, and I'm trying to respect that, I said. But I need you to understand where I'm coming from, too. I've worked hard to make sure you had a future without worrying about debt, without struggling like I did. And now you're telling me that you don't want me in your life anymore, that you're going no contact. She looked up at me then, her eyes narrowing. I didn't say it like that, Mom. I just need space. You're making it sound like I'm abandoning you. It felt like that, I admitted. It felt like you were saying you don't need me anymore. And that hurts, Ella. It really does. She stayed quiet, but at least she wasn't arguing with me, so I kept going. The thing is, if you don't want me to be a part of your life, if you're serious about needing space and going no contact after you leave for college, then I don't think I can keep the college fund for you anymore. Her face changed immediately. What do you mean? I mean, if you're planning to cut me out of your life, I'm not going to be the one funding it, I said, trying to stay firm but not too harsh. That money was meant for you to get a good education, but it was also meant to be part of our relationship. I saved that money because I love you and I wanted to give you a head start. But if you're going to cut me off, I'm not going to keep sacrificing for someone who doesn't want me around. Ella's jaw dropped a little. I could tell she wasn't expecting this. You're seriously going to take the money away just because I said I need space? It's not about space, I said. It's about the fact that you're telling me I won't be in your life anymore. If you want to be independent, then fine, be independent. But that means you can't rely on me to pay for everything and then walk away when it's convenient. She stood up then, clearly angry. So this is your way of punishing me for wanting freedom? You're taking the money back to control me just like I said. I shook my head. That's not what this is, Ella. I'm not trying to control you. I'm trying to protect myself. I've given everything for you, and now you're saying you don't want me in your life. I can't keep giving if I'm not going to be a part of your future. She was fuming. You're selfish. You're only doing this because I'm not living up to your expectations. I thought you were saving that money for me because you loved me. But I guess it was just a way to make sure I stayed under your thumb. I didn't even know how to respond to that. I had tried so hard to be understanding, to explain where I was coming from, but she wasn't hearing it. To her, this was all about control, and nothing I said was going to change her mind. I'm sorry you feel that way, I said quietly, but my decision is final. If you're serious about going no contact, then I'm taking the college fund back. I'll split it between Jake's education and my own needs. Ella stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a minute, trying to process everything that had just happened. It wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want to be at odds with my own daughter. But I had to stand up for myself. I had to draw the line somewhere. I didn't know what the future was going to look like between me and Ella. but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was making the right decision for me. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay.
The courtroom was alive with whispers, a mix of curiosity and tension filling the air. At the center of it all stood a tall black man, his wrists shackled, his suit crisp and unyielding. Across the aisle, the arresting officer leaned back, a smug grin on his face, fully expecting the man's downfall to be swift and merciless. But as the judge scanned the paperwork, that grin disappeared in an instant. The officer's confidence melted into dread as the room collectively held its breath, realizing there was more to this man than they had imagined. This wasn't just any ordinary case. It was the culmination of a day that had started in the most unexpected way. Earlier that morning, Marcus Carter, a man known for his quiet strength and dedication to justice, walked through his suburban neighborhood with purpose. Carrying his briefcase, he was on his way to an important meeting at the courthouse. Along the way, he paused to help an elderly woman struggling with her groceries, embodying the values of kindness and community he held dear. What began as an act of compassion quickly spiraled into a moment that would test every ounce of his patience and resilience. A police officer, his mind already clouded with bias, saw Marcus not as a man, but as a threat. And that misjudgment would lead to a chain of events no one in that courtroom could have foreseen. This is Real Life Stories New, where we explore the moments that challenge injustice and celebrate resilience. Stick with us as we uncover how Marcus Carter transformed humiliation into triumph, standing tall against prejudice and proving that justice, when pursued with dignity and courage, can prevail. As Marcus Carter approached the elderly woman, her frail hands trembling under the weight of her groceries, he didn't think twice. Setting down his briefcase, he carefully transferred the bags from her grasp to the bench beside her. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice soft with gratitude, her eyes glistening. Marcus offered a small, reassuring smile. For him, these small acts of kindness were part of his daily life, a reflection of the values his parents had instilled in him. He turned to leave, retrieving his briefcase, but as he straightened, he noticed the police cruiser. It slowed to a crawl, the officer inside locking eyes with him through the windshield. Marcus felt the weight of that gaze, a cold, piercing stare that seemed to strip away his humanity. The cruiser stopped. The door creaked open, and a young officer stepped out, hand resting on his holstered weapon. "You there," the officer barked, his voice cutting through the quiet of the morning. "Stay where you are." Marcus stood still, heart pounding, his thoughts racing. He wasn't breaking any laws. He hadn't done anything remotely suspicious. But he knew from experience that logic often played no role in encounters like these. The officer approached, his expression hard and unyielding. "Let me see your ID," the officer demanded. Marcus complied, maintaining his composure. The officer scrutinized the identification card as though searching for a flaw, then began tossing out vague accusations: loitering, suspicious behavior, possibly theft. None of it made sense. Marcus felt a flicker of anger rise in his chest but forced it down. Arguing wouldn't help. He'd been in situations like this before, where judgment was passed before a single word was exchanged. The elderly woman tried to intervene. "He didn't do anything wrong. He was just helping me," she said, her voice trembling. "Step aside, ma'am," the officer snapped, cutting her off without a second glance. "I'll handle this." The confrontation escalated quickly. Despite Marcus' calm demeanor and full cooperation, the officer decided to detain him. Before he could fully register what was happening, Marcus found himself pinned against the cruiser, his arm wrenched behind his back. A sharp pain shot through his shoulder as the cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists. The humiliation stung more than the physical discomfort. He could feel the weight of strangers' eyes on him, their curiosity mingling with fear and pity. At the station, things only got worse. The officer smirked as he processed Marcus, treating him with a dismissive arrogance. His briefcase was thrown carelessly onto a desk, spilling its contents, neatly organized documents and files, across the surface. The officer didn't even glance at them, but Marcus couldn't help but feel the irony. These were legal documents he had prepared for an important court case. Big meeting, huh? The officer mocked. Yeah, sure. And I'm the mayor. The sarcasm was dripping, but Marcus refused to rise to the bait. Years of dealing with prejudice had taught him that his greatest weapon was self-control. Still, the indignity of being fingerprinted, photographed, and treated like a criminal weighed heavily on him. Fragments of whispered conversations reached his ears, station staff speculating about what he'd done. Must have been something serious, one said. Probably fraud or something. Look at that suit, another added. The assumptions were almost laughable in their absurdity, but Marcus couldn't summon any humor in the moment. Instead, he thought of the countless others who had been in his position, who didn't have the resources or resilience to fight back. This wasn't just about him, it was about something much bigger. As the hours dragged on, Marcus' requests for a phone call were ignored. He was left to sit on a hard bench, wrists aching from the cuffs, until the officer finally informed him he would face a judge the next morning. The officer's smirk returned as he leaned in, his voice low and taunting. "Let's see how tough you are in court," he said. Marcus said nothing. His silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. He knew what awaited in that courtroom, even if the officer did not. The next morning, Marcus was escorted into the courthouse, handcuffed and exhausted from a sleepless night. As he stepped inside, heads began to turn. A ripple of recognition passed through the room. Court staff who knew Marcus froze, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock as they saw him shackled like a common criminal. The officer who had arrested him stood nearby, arms crossed, still wearing that overconfident grin. But as the judge began reading the charges aloud, that grin began to falter. Resisting arrest. Suspicious behavior. They were flimsy at best, and everyone in the room could see it. Then came the moment of truth. "Mr. Marcus Carter," the judge said, glancing at the paperwork before looking directly at the officer. "State's chief prosecutor." The courtroom erupted into a stunned silence, broken only by the officer's sharp intake of breath. His face turned pale, and the bravado that had carried him through the previous day evaporated in an instant. Marcus, now free of his cuffs, stood tall. His voice was steady as he recounted the events, the humiliation, and the baseless accusations. Surveillance footage and witness testimony corroborated his story, leaving no room for doubt. The judge's expression darkened as she addressed the officer, her tone sharp and unforgiving. "This was a blatant abuse of authority," she said. "An inquiry into your conduct will begin immediately." The officer tried to stammer an apology, but his words held no weight in the face of the evidence. Marcus, meanwhile, remained composed, his dignity intact. As he stepped out of the courtroom, the morning sun warming his face, he thought not of his own vindication, but of the larger fight against injustice that still lay ahead. As Marcus Carter walked out of the courthouse, the sun casting its warmth over the steps, he carried more than his vindication, he carried a renewed determination. The crowd that had gathered outside looked at him with a mix of awe and admiration. Some approached him with words of encouragement, while others stood silently, processing the profound turn of events they had just witnessed. Marcus could have gloated, could have let anger fuel his words, but instead, he chose grace. He paused, letting the moment sink in, and then spoke directly to the reporters and bystanders who had gathered. "This isn't just about me," Marcus began, his voice steady but full of conviction. "This is about every person who has ever been judged unfairly, treated unjustly, or silenced because of the color of their skin. Today, we saw justice prevail, but there are so many others who don't get this chance. That's why we must keep fighting, not with hate, but with courage, dignity, and the truth." The crowd murmured in agreement, some even applauding. Marcus turned and walked away with his head held high, not as a victim, but as a beacon of resilience and a reminder that change is possible when we stand firm against injustice. This story isn't just about Marcus Carter, it's about the fight for equality, dignity, and justice in everyday life. It's a call to action for all of us to look beyond stereotypes and challenge the biases that hold us back as a society. Marcus' journey reminds us that while the road may be difficult, standing up for what's right can inspire change far beyond ourselves. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the world differently or inspired you to take action, we encourage you to like, share, and comment below. Your voice helps stories like Marcus reach more people and spark meaningful conversations. And don't forget to subscribe to Real Life Stories New. Together, let's reach our goal of 10,000 subscribers and continue sharing stories that matter, stories that remind us of the power of courage, empathy, and justice. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story that changes lives.
You're abandoning your family, Rebecca. My mom's voice thundered through the phone, cutting through the silence of my office. I pinched the bridge of my nose, already feeling the tension settle in. Mom, I've explained this 100 times. I can't keep bailing Brian out. He's 30 years old. He needs to take responsibility for himself. Her response was immediate, sharp, and full of the same guilt-laden reproach I'd heard countless times before. He's your brother. Family is supposed to help each other. I glanced at the neatly stacked paperwork on my desk, reminders of the long hours I worked to maintain my stability. I've helped him, Mom, for years. This isn't about family. It's about the fact that he doesn't care. He spent all his savings, and now he expects me to clean up the mess. Again. My name is Rebecca, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the responsible one in the family. After my dad passed away when I was 10, I grew up fast, taking on more than most kids my age ever had to. Meanwhile, my brother Brian always had a knack for sliding by. Now at 30, he worked part-time at a convenience store and still managed to blow through his savings on expensive gadgets, nights out, and vacations he couldn't afford. When his landlord threatened to evict him, my mom didn't ask. She demanded that I cover his rent. I refused. That decision sent my mom and Brian into a tailspin. 2 days later, I woke up to a notification on my phone. My heart sank as I opened Facebook and saw a long post from my mom. Family should stick together, but sadly, not everyone believes that. Some people would rather abandon their own blood than lift a finger to help. It's a shame when greed comes before family values. I'm truly disappointed. The comments poured in. People I hadn't seen in years chimed in, offering sympathy and criticizing me for being selfish or uncaring. And then there was Brian's post. I never thought my own sister would leave me out in the cold, but I guess money means more to her than her family. At least I know who really has my back. Thanks, Mom. The words stung, but not as much as the betrayal. They were painting me as a villain to everyone we knew, twisting the story to make me look heartless. I put my phone down and stared out the window, anger bubbling under the surface. I had sacrificed so much for them over the years, and this was how they repaid me? Publicly shaming me for setting boundaries? But as the anger settled into something sharper, I made a decision. If they wanted to turn this into a public spectacle, I was ready to fight back. After seeing those Facebook posts, I couldn't shake the anger coursing through me. I had tried so hard to be the dependable one, to take care of things for the family after my dad passed. But this was too much. I sat down at my kitchen table, my laptop open in front of me, replaying the past few years in my head. How many times had I stepped in to help Brian? Too many to count. When he lost his job 2 years ago because he stopped showing up, I covered his bills until he found another one. When his car broke down, I gave him the money to fix it, only to find out later he'd used it to buy concert tickets instead. And when he borrowed money to get back on his feet, it went straight to designer sneakers and online shopping. The worst part wasn't even Brian's irresponsibility. It was my mom's unwavering defense of him. "Boys are different," she'd say whenever I brought it up. "He just needs time to figure things out." That time had turned into years of excuses, and now, with those Facebook posts, she'd gone from making excuses to outright vilifying me. I opened my email, intending to respond to a work inquiry, but I couldn't focus. The knot in my stomach wouldn't let me move on. Enough was enough. Later that evening, I called a lawyer. I explained the situation, my voice shaking with frustration as I detailed the posts and the damage they had done to my reputation. "I can't just let them get away with this," I said, my anger barely contained. The lawyer listened patiently before responding. "Defamation cases can be tricky, but if their posts have caused you real harm, whether professionally or emotionally, you have grounds to act. Let's get started by gathering evidence." I hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of anger and relief. Finally, someone was on my side. But as I gathered screenshots of the posts, an idea struck me. My dad had left an inheritance for both Brian and me, one that was supposed to be protected until we turned 25. I hadn't thought about it in years, assuming my portion was safely sitting in an account. Curiosity got the better of me. I called the lawyer back the next day. "While we're at it, can you look into my inheritance? I just want to make sure everything's in order." "Of course," the lawyer replied. I didn't know it yet, but that request was about to unravel a much bigger betrayal than a few Facebook posts. A week after I had called the lawyer, I received an email that sent a chill down my spine. The subject line read, "Inheritance Investigation Findings." I clicked on it and read through the summary carefully. My lawyer had discovered that, for the past 5 years, Brian had been withdrawing money from what should have been my portion of the inheritance. The account had been managed by my mom until I turned 25, but it seemed that Brian had somehow gained access to it after that and had been dipping into it regularly. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the document. Thousands of dollars, gone. Money I'd never even known I had, used for who knows what. When I called my lawyer to get more details, his voice was calm but firm. "It appears that your brother accessed the account without your permission. It's a clear case of theft. He's taken a significant portion of what was rightfully yours." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what he was saying. How could this happen? My mom was in charge of the account for years. She never said anything about Brian having access. "It's possible she didn't know," the lawyer said. "But it's also possible she trusted him to manage it responsibly. Either way, it's a serious breach." The implications were staggering. Not only had Brian been stealing from me, but my mom, whether knowingly or unknowingly, had let it happen. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the financial records my lawyer had sent me. Each transaction felt like a slap in the face. Concert tickets, electronics, vacations, things I had struggled to afford for myself while Brian had been using my money to fund his lifestyle. The Facebook post suddenly felt like the least of my problems. This wasn't just about public humiliation anymore. This was a betrayal that went to the very core of my family. I debated calling my mom right then and there, demanding answers. But I stopped myself. Confronting her without a plan would only lead to more deflection and guilt-tripping. Instead, I emailed my lawyer. "What's the next step?" I asked. By the time I went to bed, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this go. For years, I had been the one who sacrificed, the one who kept the peace while Brian got away with everything. Not anymore. As I turned off the light, one thought kept running through my mind. They're about to find out exactly who they're dealing with. The next day, I met with my lawyer in his office to discuss the next steps. The small room felt suffocating as I laid out every piece of information he had uncovered. "This isn't just about the inheritance," I said firmly. "Brian and my mom have crossed a line. Those Facebook posts were bad enough, but now I find out he's been stealing from me for years. I want to take action. Serious action. My lawyer nodded, his expression calm and professional. We'll start by filing for defamation based on the social media posts. But regarding the inheritance theft, we'll need to pursue a separate case. It's straightforward given the records we have, but it might get messy. Messy doesn't bother me, I replied, crossing my arms. I'm done letting them walk all over me. That evening, I called my mom. I needed answers, whether she was complicit in this or just blindly trusting Brian. Hi, Mom, I said, my voice steady. Rebecca, she answered quickly, her tone still carrying the usual edge of annoyance. Are you calling to apologize? You know, Brian is... Save it, I interrupted, cutting her off mid-sentence. I have some questions about Dad's inheritance, specifically about why Brian has been accessing my portion. There was a long pause on her end. What are you talking about? She finally asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Or was it guilt? I had a lawyer look into it, I said. For the past 5 years, Brian's been withdrawing money from my share. Thousands of dollars, Mom. Did you know about this? Her hesitation spoke volumes. Rebecca, it's not what you think, she said finally. Brian. He needed help. He promised me he'd pay it back. My chest tightened, a mixture of anger and disbelief washing over me. You knew? You knew he was stealing from me and you didn't say anything? I didn't think it was stealing, she said defensively. It's family money. He was in a tough spot, and I trusted him to handle it responsibly. I laughed bitterly. Responsibly? He's been blowing it on vacations and gadgets while I've been working myself to the bone, and you let it happen. Rebecca, please, she pleaded. You don't understand. Brian's been struggling. I thought you'd be okay without it. That's not your call to make, I snapped. I trusted you to protect that money, and you handed it over to him like it was nothing. Do you have any idea how betrayed I feel right now? She tried to argue, but I couldn't listen anymore. This conversation is over, I said coldly. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. As I hung up, a wave of clarity washed over me. For years I had let them manipulate me, guilt me into submission. Not anymore. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine. It was about finally standing up for myself. The fallout from that phone call was immediate. The next morning, my phone lit up with missed calls and frantic messages from my mom. Her tone in the voicemails shifted between defensive and desperate. Rebecca, you can't do this. Brian didn't mean any harm. Followed by, let's just sit down and talk about this as a family. You don't need to involve lawyers. But I didn't respond. I felt a sense of control. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about setting boundaries, about making it clear that I wasn't going to be their doormat any longer. Brian, of course, took a different approach. Later that day, I logged into Facebook to find a new round of posts aimed at me. First, she refuses to help her own brother. Now she's threatening to sue her family over money. Greedy, selfish, and heartless. Some people really show their true colors when it comes to cash. I stared at the post, my jaw tightening. The comments were filled with the same crowd of enablers from before, chiming in with their unsolicited opinions. She sounds awful. Family should come first, no matter what. Brian, you're better off without her. And I took a screenshot and sent it to my lawyer without a second thought. The next day, I met with him again. We're filing both cases, he said. The defamation suit is straightforward. As for the inheritance, we have more than enough evidence to prove theft. But you need to be prepared. This is going to strain your relationship with your mom even further. I leaned forward, my expression hard. It's already strained beyond repair. Let's do it. He nodded. One more thing. If this goes to court, Brian will have to explain where the money went. Are you ready for that? It could get ugly. A part of me hesitated. Did I want to know how deep this betrayal ran? But then I thought about the years I'd spent sacrificing for a family that never appreciated me. I'm ready, I said firmly. That evening, I got another call from my mom. This time I picked up. Rebecca, she said, her voice trembling. I talked to Brian. He told me some things about the money. I didn't know it was this bad. What did he tell you? I asked, my tone sharp. Her silence spoke volumes. I'm sorry, she finally whispered. I didn't realize how much he'd taken. I should have stopped him. Her words felt hollow, but I let her continue. I'm going to talk to him again. We'll figure this out. Just, please don't take this to court. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. It's out of my hands now, Mom. You should have thought about this years ago. As I hung up, I felt a mix of anger and relief. She was starting to see the truth, but it was far too late to undo the damage. A week later, my lawyer called with an update that caught me completely off guard. We've been reviewing additional financial records, he began, his tone calm but serious. And it turns out Brian hasn't just been dipping into your inheritance. He's also been misusing some of your mom's accounts. I froze. What do you mean? It seems he's been accessing funds from an account your mom set aside for her retirement, he explained. We found consistent withdrawals that matched the same pattern as the ones he made from your inheritance. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. My mom had been so adamant about defending Brian, so blind to his faults, and now he'd stolen from her too? Does she know? I asked finally. Not yet, he replied. But if we proceed with both cases, this information will come to light. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. As much as I was angry with my mom for enabling Brian, the thought of her losing her retirement savings made my stomach churn. Later that evening, I called her. Mom, I began, my voice steady. I need to tell you something, and it's not going to be easy to hear. What is it? She asked, her tone weary. I explained what the lawyer had uncovered. The silence on her end was deafening. He took my money? She finally whispered, her voice shaking. Yes, Mom, I said, softening my tone. I didn't want to tell you this, but you deserve to know. Brian's been stealing from both of us. Her response was a mix of shock and devastation. I can't believe this, she said, her voice breaking. I trusted him. I trusted him with everything. You shouldn't have, I said gently. I know you love him, but you've been enabling him for years. This is what happens when there are no consequences. She began to cry, and for the first time I felt a pang of sympathy for her. As much as she had hurt me, she was also a victim of Brian's selfishness. What do we do now? She asked through her tears. We let the legal process play out, I said firmly. This isn't just about the money anymore. It's about accountability. The following days were tense. My lawyer filed both cases, and I could feel the weight of the upcoming confrontation pressing down on me. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew it was necessary. For years, I had allowed my mom and Brian to take advantage of my kindness. But this time, I was standing my ground. It was time for them to face the consequences of their actions, no matter how much it hurt. The first court date arrived sooner than I expected. Sitting in the courtroom, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. On one side, I wanted justice for what Brian had done, for the years of entitlement, for the theft, for the way he had painted me as the villain. But on the other side, I knew this process would be painful, dragging our family's darkest secrets into the light. When Brian entered the courtroom with my mom, his smug expression made my blood boil. He had the audacity to look bored, like this was just another inconvenience in his life. My mom, however, looked completely defeated. She avoided my gaze, her shoulders hunched as though the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. The lawyer presented the evidence methodically. Transaction records, bank statements, and screenshots of the social media posts were laid out in black and white. Each time my lawyer spoke, I could see Brian shifting uncomfortably in his seat. And when it came time for Brian to speak, his tone was predictably deflective. I didn't mean for things to get this far, he said, his voice dripping with faux sincerity. I was struggling, okay? I only took the money because I thought I could pay it back. But Rebecca doesn't understand what it's like to need help. She's always had everything together. My jaw clenched as I listened to his excuses. Struggling didn't explain the vacations, the gadgets, or the nights out. And as much as he tried to play the victim, the evidence told a different story. When the judge asked my mom to testify, she hesitated, glancing at Brian nervously. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "I trusted Brian," she admitted. "I thought he'd use the money responsibly, but I didn't know how much he'd taken, or what he was using it for. I didn't realize how much he'd hurt Rebecca." Her words stung, but they also carried a glimmer of accountability. She was acknowledging the truth. The court ruled in my favor. Brian was ordered to repay the money he had stolen, and the defamation case was settled with a public apology that both he and my mom had to issue online. It wasn't a perfect victory. I knew it would take years for Brian to pay back what he owed, and the apology, while satisfying, didn't erase the damage they had done. But it was a start. As we left the courtroom, Brian shot me a glare. "I hope you're happy," he spat. "I am," I said simply, meeting his gaze without flinching. My mom lingered behind, her eyes filled with tears. "Rebecca, I don't know how to make this right," she said quietly. "You start by being honest," I replied. "With me, with yourself, and with Brian. No more excuses." She nodded slowly, her face a mix of guilt and sadness. "I'll try," she whispered. That evening I sat in my apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened. The courtroom battle was over, but the real work was just beginning. Setting boundaries with my family wasn't going to be easy, but I felt like I had the strength to do it. And as much as it hurt to see my mom and brother for who they really were, I felt a sense of relief knowing I had finally stood up for myself. In the weeks following the court ruling, life felt oddly quiet. I wasn't inundated with calls or messages from my mom anymore, demanding that I be there for Brian or solve their latest crisis. It was as though the verdict had forced her to take a step back, or maybe she was just too embarrassed to face me. But the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like peace. One afternoon, as I sorted through my bills at the kitchen table, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed my mom's name. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to pick up. "Hi, Mom," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Hi, Rebecca," she replied, her voice hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About the inheritance, the court case, Brian." I waited, unsure of where this was going. "I didn't want to believe it at first," she continued. "But I can't ignore the truth anymore. You were right. About him, about me. I let him take advantage of you, and I stood by while he hurt you. I'm so sorry." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For years I had dreamed of an apology like this, but now that it was here, I didn't know how to feel. "Thank you for saying that," I said finally. "But it's not just about apologizing, Mom. It's about changing. For years I've let you and Brian treat me like I didn't matter. That has to stop." She sighed. "I know. I've been thinking about how I can do better. I just hope it's not too late to fix things between us." I didn't respond right away. "It's not too late," I said eventually, "but it's going to take time." Meanwhile, Brian had gone radio silent. Part of me wondered if he was plotting some sort of revenge, but my lawyer assured me the legal agreements made it impossible for him to retaliate financially. Still, I knew better than to trust him. One afternoon, I received a notification that Brian had posted on Facebook. Against my better judgment, I opened it, bracing myself for another round of vitriol. Instead, I found a post that was markedly different from his usual tone. "I want to apologize to everyone I've hurt, especially my sister, Rebecca. I made mistakes I can't undo, and I'm working to make things right. I know it'll take time, but I hope she'll eventually forgive me." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Was he actually trying to take responsibility, or was this just another performance? Either way, I decided not to respond. I wasn't ready to open that door again. Not yet. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild my life. I threw myself into work, pursued hobbies I'd neglected, and even started planning a long overdue vacation. My relationship with my mom remained fragile but functional. She made an effort to call me weekly, not to complain or demand anything, but to ask how I was doing. It was a small step, but it felt significant. As for Brian, I kept my distance. The court had forced him to pay back the money he had stolen, but I knew it would be years before I saw most of it. That was fine by me. I wasn't holding my breath for his redemption. What mattered most was that I had finally reclaimed my power. Months later, I found myself sitting on my balcony with a cup of tea, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about my family or their endless demands. Life had changed in ways I never thought possible. The constant tension that used to weigh on my shoulders had lifted, replaced by a calm I didn't know I was capable of. I had always thought that standing up for myself would mean losing everything, my family, my sense of belonging. But instead, it had given me something I'd been searching for all along: peace. My mom and I had begun to rebuild our relationship, but it was slow. She still called once a week, often to update me on small things like her garden or a book she was reading. These conversations felt lighter, freer, as though the weight of unspoken expectations had finally disappeared. As for Brian, he remained distant. His court-ordered payments came in sporadically, and while I appreciated the restitution, I didn't depend on it. The truth was, I didn't need his apology or his money to move forward. I had learned to stand on my own, not out of anger or spite, but out of respect for myself. And that was enough. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized the most significant change wasn't in my family, it was in me. For years, I had been caught in a cycle of seeking approval from people who only seemed to take me for granted. I had bent over backward to support my family, sacrificing my own happiness and stability in the process. But standing up for myself, even when it was hard, had shown me a different path. My mom's tentative efforts to rebuild our relationship were a small comfort. She was trying, in her own way, to make amends. While I didn't fully trust her yet, I could see glimpses of the mother I'd hoped she could be, someone who cared about me for who I was, not just for what I could provide. Brian, on the other hand, was a different story. His attempts at public apologies felt hollow, and I wasn't ready to let him back into my life. Maybe one day I'd be able to forgive him, but that day wasn't today. What mattered most was that I had learned to set boundaries, to value my own time and effort. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I doubted myself, but I knew now that standing up for my worth was always the right choice. As I sipped my tea, I felt a quiet sense of pride. My family might not have changed completely, but I had, and that was enough. The peace I'd found was hard-earned, and I wasn't letting it go.